Welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of the Nonprofit Show. There are a lot of nonprofits going through changes right now across our country, and there's a lot of drama with that whole issue of labor and how we deal with this. But our guest today, Casey Williams, says, hey, wait, you don't have to have drama, but you will if you don't do it right. And so we're going to talk to Casey, Tim and I, about what are some of these things that we need to be thinking about if we're changing the labor construct of our organization. We could not be doing this work and having these amazing conversations without our partners. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, and Tim Sarantonio, woohoo, is joining us today, the Generosity Spectrum Mastermind. Tim's got an exciting week because things are happening with his board game and Generosity Roundtable. You're probably seeing a lot of it out there in social media, and so we want to say congratulations, Tim, and we're excited you would take time off from this busy week to do this.
I'm honestly excited to stop talking about my stuff and focus on these bigger problems and questions. And that's the whole point of all of this. So thanks for having me.
Hey, man, I love it. I think it's great. Casey Williams is chair of the nonprofit practice group at Liebert, Cassidy, and Whitmore. What is it that you do? And I'm so excited to actually have you with us because we don't see a lot of big firms that actually have pulled out their nonprofit practice. So welcome and talk to us about what it is you do.
Absolutely. Thank you. But before that, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Julia, Tim, I really appreciate it. What do we do? Well, at Liebert, Cassidy, Whitmore, we represent two types of clients. We represent public agencies like police departments and libraries and counties doing really wonderful direct service work for everybody. And we also represent nonprofits. That's it, just two types of clients that are doing mission-driven work. And our nonprofit practice in particular, we're basically outside general counsel, right? Big, huge for-profit Fortune 500 companies, they have a fleet of attorneys internally that work for them. Nonprofits, we're scrappy, we're focused on the work. We don't always have, despite our best efforts, the same level of resources, but you have the same complex legal issues, right? If you're a for-profit company and you have employees, and you're a nonprofit company and you have employees, the same laws apply, right? So you have all those complex legal issues, and what we do is we advise on employment law, but we also advise on board governance and kind of grant agreements and vendor contracts, and we're having a big event, and should we be concerned about all of these people coming and liability? And so it's a really wonderful practice because you get to learn so much about what mission-driven organizations do, as well as, today, some of the kind of difficult and uncertain financial environments they're facing.
Well, we are thrilled that you are in this space, right? Because we need more minds like this. And so I'm really excited to dig in with this on this topic. Tim and I, in the green room, we're talking about labor is an issue in the nonprofit sector. We don't often address it, but it really is an issue. And so let's get into the very first part of this. Talking about workforce reduction, what does it look like when we need to be defining and documenting this work? I mean, how should we even start?
You start by defining the problem you're trying to solve.
Okay.
It sounds really simple to put it that way, but that's where you start, because there are really complex challenges, even in difficult financial times, right? Programs close, strategic decisions have to be made, budgets change, right? Philanthropic priorities change, and sometimes you have to make hard decisions. And so the very first thing that happens is you have to define what is the business objective we're seeking to achieve with this reorganization. We need to reduce our budget by $1 million. We need to close this program. We need to shut down this center, right? It's a defined, clear business objective.
Mm-hmm.
You need to state it in writing. This is our defined, clear business objective that we are trying to resolve through this business reorganizational process. And the reason you start there is because I would say 9 times out of 10, when I start this conversation with a client, and I mean this really respectfully, what they start with are the employees. This employee is wonderful and we don't want to lose them, and we're just never going to survive without them, or maybe sometimes this employee is really difficult and we're thinking that this might be a pathway to resolving some pretty difficult, employee relations issues. And I have to back them up. It happens. And I have to back them up and say, that's not what a reorganization is for. That's what performance management is for.
Yeah.
But a reorganization is about solving a business problem. What is the business problem? Define it, and then let's document it. So I literally suggest a memo. It doesn't have to be a tome. It doesn't have to be a multi-chapter. It can be 2-3 pages. But what is the problem you're seeking to solve? And you put it in writing today, so that if there is ever a challenge, if you do ever find yourself being called to, explain why this wasn't discriminatory or, something like that, you can say, here's the memo we produced at the time, stating what our reason was, defining it, documenting it.
Wow, Tim, you and I are just like, whew, because
well, as someone who's been on the receiving end of these types of things too, I actually think back, when I was laid off from a nonprofit job, and it was an individual thing. It wasn't a reorganization thing. It was a performance thing. In retrospect, they were right? Number go up. Number didn't go up, basically. Mm-hmm. And so when the business side was explained to me, I didn't fight it. I actually understood it, right? It was very early in my career. I actually like to use that story. Look, we're still buddies. The person who did it, right? I talked to her like 2 weeks ago, right? Because if it's a business decision, and I think that's one of the things that sometimes people it's very hard to kind of, parse out the individual emotional feelings on these types of things. But at the same time, you don't use it to solve a problem that you can, like, in many ways, it's like a last resort to go this route, because it could be very disruptive in a lot of different ways. So really having that business case laid out, and I know we're going to get into the specifics and things not to do as well when you're thinking through this. It's a really serious problem. And I think that it's a problem in terms of, we don't talk about it, Julia. So I'm so thankful that we have this conversation and space to even address this type of thing. Because again, I've been through these situations on both sides, and if it's a clear story, it hurts, but at least it doesn't seem like it's a personal thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So Casey, when we talk about this, and I love that you started out this way, because I think it helps us to level set and kind of frame up the process. When you talk about defining that selection criteria and validating it, is this going to really be something that goes across the organization, where you're pulling in people from the board and from, your accounting finance department? Because it seems to me like just talking about it could be disruptive or getting people freaked out. So how do you kind of get everybody understanding this is a business decision, or do you keep it tightly kind of under wraps before you have to explore it?
Well, I don't mean to give you the so lawyerly response, but it sort of depends on the organization and its size. Something that you said that I think gets on it is, you have to have conversations with your business office about it. Do you have conversations with the entire workforce about it when you don't know what your plan is? No, right? You got to think strategically and think about the timing and when the processes or when the communications go out. But the conversation does have to be had. This is I wouldn't say the most fun topic to talk about, but often organizations are really reluctant to have it because it's a hard conversation. So by the time they're having it, it's too late, right? It's going to be a rushed process that doesn't leave people feeling the way you felt, Tim, right? Oh, I understand the business decision. I feel respected, right? Instead, it leaves people feeling really like their dignity, the impact on them personally wasn't really thought about. So you gotta have to have the conversation earlier than later and take your time with having it. So that does start with the board. The board has to approve a budget. If they've been looking at a deficit budget 2-3 years in a row, it's time to start having a harder conversation. And maybe that's tied to your strategic plan. That doesn't mean the board says, eliminate these 4 or 5 positions. They don't, again, depending on your size, aren't normally involved in that detail at kind of a larger, more established nonprofit, but they might say, we need to reduce the budget by 10%. And then from there, it's going to go to finance. It's going to go to department leads, and particularly that C-suite to define, this is our business objective. Okay, how do we achieve it? And that's where criteria comes into mind. What we're talking about when we mean criteria is, what are the factors that we're going to use to identify positions, not people, positions that may need to be eliminated or phased out. So if we're going to close, we run 5 daycare centers and we're going to close 1, well, okay, anybody who is assigned to 1 daycare center, right, those positions are going to be parted with. Sometimes we need to reduce, the budget for docents at our museum by 10%, and we've got 20 docents, so that means we're going to need to let go 4, right, or 6. I don't do my math very well, right? So how do we pick the 6 docents from the 20? Well, you have to come up with selection criteria, and the more objective, the better. So what's objective criteria? Seniority, years of experience, education, and concrete things we can point to help us select. Now, that's not always going to be possible. There are some times that subjective criteria have to come into the calculus. You might need to think of things like, certain aptitudes or certain kinds of experience, sometimes performance, right? Sometimes we don't love it though, because sometimes performance is not as documented as you want. So if you're going to use performance for a criteria, it's okay, how are we going to measure that? Did they get a certain rating on their performance review this year? That's objective and measurable. So-and-so doesn't love so-and-so, not objective and measurable. So we don't typically like things like attitude or energy or cultural fit, because they can let unconscious bias and favoritism come into the process. But whatever criteria you have, you're gonna have to have criteria. So part of that documentation and deliberative discussion that you're asking about starts with, okay, here's a problem we're trying to solve, and here are the factors we're going to use to identify positions that may need to be phased out in order to achieve our problem, or in order to solve our problem.
Right. It's so interesting because as you're speaking this through, the process, I'm thinking that you're using an approach that a lot of nonprofits abandon, and that's because we tend to run more emotionally, right? It's an interesting thing where, this sense of, well, this is a tough time, we'll get through it, or, like an emotional appeal to where we should be talking about a business appeal, right? And it seems to me like it's such a trap that emotive, mission-driven part of us that makes us so good in this sector ultimately becomes our Achilles heel, because we can't divorce ourselves from some of these factors that we really should be, more clear about. It's an interesting thing.
Emotion comes into play. I think compassion is appropriate. I would challenge nonprofit leaders to think about having the conversation earlier. Having the hard conversation actually is compassionate. Right? Yeah. Giving people as much notice as you can, helping them understand it, having your comms, your communications be tight and compassionate and like just really dialed in. I think serves that emotional need far more than just delaying the decision.
That's the part I wanted to chime in about. Having been on, and witnessed this, a few different things, I think there's where the nonprofit sector can maybe, Julia, take that emotion is let's avoid some of the usual phrases that get tossed around in corporate land, right? Like, don't trim the fat. Let's not trim the fat, right? In terms of talking about people like that. Like, these are people. And at the end of the day, the resources, the money, the energy, all of that might not have worked out in terms of them, but they're still people at the end of the day. So I love that we're highlighting the compassion in these hard conversations. Again, I've lived through these things, had more jobs than, my kids love to play what job did daddy have, right? But like at the end of the day, they're still people. And I think it's really critical to lead with that compassion, especially in those hard conversations. And it has to come from the top, right? It's modeled at the top. And that's why I think it's so critical to go, yeah, okay, we're going to have a bit of a laddering on this information, this information. And then we have the larger communication, especially if it's a larger organization, right? You might have to call the Zoom meeting if you're distributed, or the in-person thing. Like, be very, very careful that you're not recreating scenes from Succession, for goodness sake.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, Casey, because there's something called the WARN Act. That in itself sounds perilous, just the name. Talk to us about that as we understand how we're going to communicate. We understand let me back up, why we're going to do this, what we need to do. We've defined all these things. I love your process and your methodology. But then we have this issue with federal and state governance. What does that look like? And let's start with the WARN Act.
Yeah, the WARN Act stands for Worker Adjustment Retraining Notification Act. I think I'm not good at my acronyms, but it breaks down to WARN. And the basic idea is, if you are a large employer, which under federal law basically means 100 or more employees, you have to give 60 days advance notice if you're going to do a large layoff, which breaks down to about 50 or more employees being impacted.
Wow.
There's
Okay.
a lot of nuance to it, right? Like, how you count the 100 is complex. Who's an employee for the 50 person threshold is complex. There's some rolling kind of layoff issues that come up if you're doing this in like kind of a series of processes where you might be looking at a 90-day window. But you got to give advance notice if all that nuance comes into play and you're a covered employee, and this is a qualifying WARN Act reduction in force. The notice goes to the employees and it says, hey, we're very sorry that this is happening, but after careful consideration, we have to have, reduce our budget, and your position is being eliminated on X date. It's got to be 60 days in advance of the notice, or in advance of that date. And then the notice also goes to, if you happen to have a union in your workforce, it has to go to the union. And it has to go to the highest elected official in either the county or state or maybe city that you live in. In California, which is where I am, as an example, we file these online, actually, with a state agency. So they're all available. So once you hit that 60-day deadline, that goes out, and it's basically public knowledge once your WARN Act go out. And there are folks that read and watch and monitor WARN Act notices because they tell you something about the economy. They tell you about what's happening in the world. And if you're planning for your layoff, it means that you need to be prepared, not just 60 days out, right? Because you'll be preparing these notices, but several weeks in advance of that. What's our comms plan?
Right.
Not just with the people who might be calling from the local newspaper who saw the WARN Act notice go out, but also your staff, right? Very importantly, your staff. What's that one-on-one meeting going to be with each person that you meet with, but also, what's that all hands going to be if you're going to do all hands, which I'm happy to chat with people about. I have lots of thoughts on. And if you're listening to this and you're like, good, because we only have 80 employees, so I'm never going to have to worry about WARN Act. You should know that there are what we call mini state WARN Acts. So a lot of states have their own WARN Act that usually have lower thresholds for coverage. So for example, here where I am at in California, there is a 75. You only have to have 75 employees, and it includes part-time and full-time employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such an interesting thing. And, isn't California the 5th largest economy in the world?
I think we like to say that. We like to think when anybody's like, why would anybody move to California? I'm like, well.
Yeah, but I mean, it's really an interesting thing. For me, as it goes in California, so goes the rest of the nation, and so many of these things. And we need to be understanding that this becomes, something to think about, and why we need to get that going. You mentioned something interesting about, preparing in that advance notice all the way down to the different documentation. And if we could talk about that a little bit, about these release agreements and the severance piece of this, so that everybody is rowing in the same direction. That's not just something you create super quickly.
No,
I mean,
not at our recommendation, at least. Probably not yours either, right? So a severance might help to back up and just explain what severance is, because I didn't understand it until I started really working in this area. Severance is money, but it can sometimes be, reimbursements for COBRA coverage. Sometimes it can be like a connection. I'm going to pay a month for you to have access to a career coach. It can be other things to help with the transition. But it's usually something that the person is not otherwise entitled to. So it can't be a cash out of their own vacation, or they can't be their final pay. It's something that they didn't otherwise have an entitlement to, unless you happen to have at your organization a severance policy. Some nonprofits do say, in the event of a RIF, we are going to give everybody 2 weeks severance. So as you're planning this, again, weeks, months out from when it may happen, you need to review your employment policies to find out, do we have any obligation to provide severance? You might also want to look at contracts. If you have contracts with any of your employees, particularly higher level employees, sometimes have contractual entitlements to severance. But assuming that doesn't exist, severance is just something that you do kind of out of the kindness of your heart, sort of, and I'll come back to the sort of, but what you give as an organization to individuals who are impacted. And I think it's really important to think about if you can stretch your budget to do it, because it's becoming just more and more standard in the industry, but also it is that way of having compassion, right? This is people's rent, right? And so trying to have a little bit of compassion if you can do it. But I say sort of, because I also do, as an attorney and as I care deeply about this sector, and this sector has limited resources. We don't generally give away things for free. So one of the things that severance often is conditioned upon is signing a release. So in exchange for the severance, the employee will sign a release that says, I'm not going to come back and bring a lawsuit and kind of challenge this. And it allows in that exchange for the nonprofit to get some finality, right? To understand that these relationships are ending, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's a really important thing to consider. We'll offer severance, but in exchange for release. And going back to emotion and compassion, I think a lot of nonprofits, from a values perspective, are hesitant to require the release. But I really think when we're thinking about being disciplined in our business perspectives and approaches, it's pretty important. Now, I'm going to be very loyally about this. If you're going to do severance and you're going to condition it on signing a release, please make sure the severance agreement and release are drafted well. There are lots of really nuanced requirements that are state by state often about what can or cannot go into a release. The best example I have of this is the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act. The Older Workers Benefit Protection Act requires, in order to get a valid release for an age discrimination claim, that the employee be given 21 days to consider whether to sign the release and 7 days to revoke it. Now, I think a lot of people more and more are aware of this, but what they may not be aware is if that layoff is part of, or that individual is part of a group layoff where 2 or more people are all, being let go because of a reorganization, what we've been talking about, they actually get 45 days, not the typical 21 days. And then there's supposed to be this whole chart at the end that tells, the person considering signing the release, the different ages of the positions being impacted. And so if you're on ChatGPT, which I love, I mean, we all need to use ChatGPT there, or Claude, or whatever your favorite is. This is not the time to have an agreement made. I would say think about seeing if you can access some legal counsel to help you with that.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I mean, I think you can chat it up to get an idea of what you might be looking at. But the reality is you have got to secure, some good advice, which you should have that relationship rowing with you all along, right? It sounds to me like you don't just come in, swoop in at the end and find somebody that understands, the nonprofit sector and labor at the same time.
Well, hopefully we exist. I'm here. There are a few others out there. Ideally, work with somebody in your state that does the work, because it can be very, especially employment law, very state-based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super important. We don't have a lot of time left, and this has gone by so fast because there's just so many things to think about. But what about this issue of offboarding? Because it seems to me that a lot of times when we have something, and I'm going to use the word catastrophic, and maybe that's not the right word, but so dramatic and so tough, offboarding kind of just goes like to the back.
Yeah.
How should we think about this? Because it's a different time.
You're right. I do think some people tend to think, especially in this context, that the offboarding process is that last administrative task we need to deal with. They're not thinking about it from a substantive or values perspective, but it's one of the most visible aspects of the reduction in force. Right? This is what everybody's going to see and hear about and talk about, is how was I treated in that meeting? And then what did everybody else hear in it, right? So it requires some planning. You need to think about who and when, how we're going to meet with people. Are we doing it? I think even if it's not actual physical face-to-face, get on a Zoom, get on a Teams, turn on your camera, talk to people. Mm-hmm. And then what are you going to tell them, right? Our general advice is start right away with what's happening. Don't leave them uncertain.
Yep.
Don't talk about it in some sort of like kind of indirect way. Be direct with them, right? Which is hard to do. We hate delivering bad news. I'm not great at it myself. But in this moment, treating them respectfully is telling them what's happening, and then give them answers to all the questions that they have, but they might not be asking because they're frankly kind of dealing with some shocking, potentially catastrophic information, right? Yeah. So tell them when they're getting their final pay. Tell them if they're getting severance. Don't make them sign it in that meeting ever. But tell them, we're going to be emailing you a severance agreement. This is when we'd like you to return your property, your laptop. You take the time to, if this isn't your last day, when your last day is, like give them information that they need to function in the moment. And make sure that you've planned all that out. And sorry to be so California specific, we have so many laws in California. Another fun California law is you have to pay final pay on the individual's last day. Mm-hmm. And you have to cash out any accrued vacation or PTO. Mm-hmm. So if you have not planned for that, and you're like, we're going to meet with people in a week, and I'm like, well, is your payroll going to be able to do that? So like planning for all of that is part of that offboarding process. But if you're deliberate about it and you give it some care, I think it's a really great way to exhibit your values.
Right. Casey, this has been amazing. It's been a gut check for me in so many ways, but really far more compassionate than I would have thought. And I think the compassion rolls into an intellectual piece of this, right? I mean, the more you want to do the right thing and you roll in this compassion piece, it ends up being, it seems like to me, mitigating some of your risk, right? And so very interesting conversation. Casey Williams, she's the chair of nonprofit practice group at Liebert, Cassidy, Whitmore. Really a cool conversation. And I have a sinking suspicion we're going to have to revisit some of these things with you and drill down, because it's been absolutely fascinating. And I am very challenged by some of your numbers. I was thinking we were going to be talking about much bigger organizations, much larger. Like I was thinking like 300, plus, but to hear you talk about it like this is a real thing for all of us across the nonprofit sector. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, been really, really interesting. Hey, we get to have these amazing conversations each and every day because we have amazing partners, and they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that join us day in and day out. Next Friday will be our 1,600th episode of the Nonprofit Show. And this is going to be ranking right up there with one of my faves, I got to say. This has really been an interesting conversation. As we end each and every episode of the Nonprofit Show, we leave with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.